Okay, now we return to a marine focus, and it's a pleasure to introduce Rebecca Albright, who's Curator of Invertebrate Zoology at the California Academy of Sciences and focuses on coral reef biology, ecology, and biogeochemistry. Okay.
Thank you. So my area of expertise is the impacts of ocean acidification on coral reef ecosystems. It's something that I've been studying for about 15 years now. And today I was asked to speak about solutions, which is something I've been trying to incorporate into my research increasingly over the last couple of years. And so on the heels of the IPCC report, the 1.5 degree report that came out a few weeks ago, we saw some pretty dismal projections about the fate of coral reefs in particular, that if we're looking at 1.5 degrees C, we're looking at losing about 70 to 90% of coral reefs. And if we edge towards 2 degrees, we're effectively going to lose most of them, over 99%. And so as the decline in reef health accelerates, the demand for solutions to try to mitigate and adapt or help these ecosystems to adapt to change has been increasing. And there have been some nods to that this morning about how managers really want on-the-ground solutions to implement now. And so what I thought I'd talk about today is an exercise that Sarah Cooley from the Ocean Conservancy and I have been working on over this year to kind of help advance the discussion about adaptation and mitigation strategies with respect to ocean acidification impacts on reefs. And I just want to say briefly that arguably ocean acidification is not the elephant in the room in terms of reef decline right now. Warming is, but and for a lot of these conversations, they're very parallel. So you can sub a different intervention, but the same kinds of challenges, the same kinds of conversations are happening. How do I do this? I feel like everybody is having the same. So in terms of research, we know pretty well at this point, or increasingly, the impacts of ocean acidification on these processes that underpin the very existence of coral reefs. So we know ocean acidification undermines calcification, dissolution, reproduction, and recruitment, photosynthesis, and respiration. And then we know that reefs support all of these different ecosystem processes and services, like storm protection and erosion, everything from bioprospecting, searching for new pharmaceuticals, fisheries, tourism. Then all of these services are valued at almost $400 billion a year. And what we don't know, as we've talked about today, is scaling from what we've seen in laboratory results up to ecosystem level impacts. You can kind of trace these pathways through and make some logical conclusions, but we haven't actually experimentally made very many of those leaps at this point. But what became very clear through this exercise was that of the adaptation and mitigation strategies that are on the table, none of them address all of these things. And so we know that existing ecosystems that are intact are much better at supporting biophysical processes and ecosystem services than restored ecosystems. So at the end of the day, what it comes down to is kind of triaging and deciding for your particular place, for your particular time, which of these are most important to you, which processes support that service, and which strategy will get you to your end result. So in general, the concepts for supporting reefs into the future are to support adaptation and to support resilience. And there's a variety of different ways that you can do this, ranging from conventional strategies like marine protected areas or mitigating secondary sources of stressors, all the way to unconventional strategies like geochemical buffering, liming the seawater in terms of ocean acidification, assisted evolution, things that are much more interventionist. And we know that as we move into the future and as CO2 increases, your options become fewer and the success of those options decreases. This was a framework that a group of us produced at a workshop in Australia only about 4 or 5 years ago. And the people in the room were a mixture of scientists and managers and policymakers. And we came up with this framework. And we were all arguing at the time as to whether the Great Barrier Reef should be under just aggressive conventional management of just protecting it, or a little bit of unconventional management of restoration. And this was prior to the first mass bleaching event that the reefs, well, not the first, but in 2015, there was the first of recent mass bleaching events that hit the Great Barrier Reef. There was a second one shortly thereafter, and that have now impacted 2/3 of the Great Barrier Reef. This is a system that's 2,300 kilometers long, largest continuous reef system in the world. And 1/3 of the Great Barrier Reef has died. And so in the time span of 3 to 4 years, we've gone from thinking that we should be here to thinking that we should be here and actively restoring this system. And so this is just highlighting the need to have this toolbox of solutions that we can offer in a timely manner for these systems that change in a time span that we didn't anticipate. So when talking about OA solutions for mitigating or adapting to ocean acidification, some of you may be familiar with this figure. This is a really nice figure that Jean-Pierre Gattuso created in 2015 that breaks things out into mitigating CO2 and then adapting to it. And so this is what Sarah and I based our exercise on, and we adapted it a little bit. But up here we have things like reducing CO2 emissions, reducing other greenhouse gases, coastal pollutants, all the way down to helping these systems adapt and through like assisted evolution, MPA, et cetera. And what Sarah and I did, which I'll show you on the next slide, is kind of consider all of these down here to be adaptation strategies. So we considered mitigation to be, for the purposes of this exercise and talk, mitigation is any technique that directly reduces CO2. So from reducing CO2 in the atmosphere, like climate policy, to actually liming or neutralizing the seawater. And then adaptation are strategies that don't mitigate CO2, but help the ecosystem deal with the elevated CO2. So this is it's kind of flipped on its side. This is our novel framework now. So we have adaptations on the left, mitigation on the right. For the purposes of this talk, I'm not going to talk about CO2 control via policy. That's not my area of expertise, but obviously that is the ultimate solution. But these are some on-the-ground solutions that have been suggested. So chemical remediation like liming, geochemical buffering, and other options to remove CO2 from seawater like phytoremediation. On the left, not addressing the CO2 content in seawater, but helping ecosystems cope with it. Socioeconomic mechanisms, again, I'm not going to talk about that today because I'm not a social scientist, but there need to be discussions around helping communities and hundreds of millions of people around the world that will be displaced by the loss of ecosystems adapt to their changing condition. And these adaptations actually focus on the coral reefs themselves. So assisted evolution, reef restoration, and then some passive techniques that are less interventionist of spatial planning and mitigating secondary stressors. So what we did, and I'm not going to go through all of it today just because there's too many to cover in 20 minutes, is just look at a few and try to compare them on an apples-to-apples basis. What's the technique? How much does it cost? What's the scalability? What are the risks and limitations, et cetera? So I'll go through a few examples. So first, phytoremediation. So for those of you not familiar with this technique, the basis of this is that most or many marine plants, seagrasses and other marine plants, are carbon limited. And so if you increase the CO2 content in seawater, they will increase net photosynthesis, and most of them are also net autotrophic. And so this has been tested for a variety of different species of seagrass on the Great Barrier Reef, and all of them showed increased photosynthesis with increased CO2. And so the concept here is, could you plant seagrasses or co-locate them with coral reefs to suck all the CO2 out of the water if they were upstream from a coral reef and benefit the coral reef downstream so that it had greater calcification, et cetera. There have been some studies. There are some observations in the Florida Reef Track that coral reefs that were inshore of large seagrass areas had elevated saturation state and were generally healthier overall. That was attributed possibly to this effect. And there have been modeling studies, a biophysical model that was done on Heron Island and the Great Barrier Reef, where they said, okay, if we were actually to do this, how big would a seagrass farm have to be, and where would it have to be located in order to actually mitigate ocean acidification impact on Heron Reef? And what they found through that modeling study was that you would have to have a seagrass farm that was 1.9 square kilometers, optimally located upstream of this reef, in order for it to affect a 0.1 change in saturation state over the entirety of the reef. And again, that's optimally harvested, so you're constantly taking the seagrass out of the water as well. So costs for this, we couldn't find costs in the literature. Sarah and I were kind of combing through the literature. What we did resort to was seagrass restoration costs. So from a meta-analysis, we found costs ranging from $400,000 to $700,000 per hectare. And arguably that is conservative because of if you were doing this to mitigate ocean acidification, you would have to be harvesting it actively as well, which you wouldn't necessarily be doing with restoration. So some risks and limitation with this approach, still uncertain whether this would actually be effective, because at some point nutrients would probably become limiting too. In that modeling study, they assumed you could mitigate that by dosing nutrients constantly in the seawater, but doing that upstream of a coral reef may be problematic as well. Scaling up is challenging, which is a theme that we'll see with a lot of these different approaches. And then the effects are changeable because different reefs have different residence times, different species, et cetera. Chemical remediation. So ocean acidification in general is a timing mismatch problem, where if this were to happen over geological timescales of thousands of years, the amount of CO2 in the seawater and carbonic acid that was produced would be neutralized by rock weathering. That's not happening because we're doing this too fast. And so there have been some solutions of can we expedite that by speeding up these neutralization or weathering processes. And so there's actual rock weathering where you would grind up calcium carbonate and put it in the water, or grind up silicate rocks in order to neutralize that carbonic acid, or you could just add a base to seawater like sodium hydroxide to try to neutralize the carbonic acid. I led a study on One Tree Reef a few years ago where we tried this. And so we took an 800 square meter patch of reef. We dosed it with sodium hydroxide to see if we could elevate the saturation state on the reef and enhance calcification. And what we found was that you can do it. It was a short-term response, but we did it repeatedly over the course of a month. And every single time we did it, we saw that the overall calcification response of the reef was improved. We'll talk about limitations with that in a second. And then there have been modeling studies again that looked at the response and whether this would be feasible for the Great Barrier Reef, the China Sea, the South China Sea. And they found that yes, you can dose, and it would increases the alkalinity, increases the response, the calcification response. This modeling study showed that this actually, there are feedbacks, so increasing alkalinity caused more CO2 uptake. So you have to take that into consideration. But this does seem like it could be a feasible thing. Scalability is an issue. So running through a case study of what this would look like at scale based on the study that I did at One Tree Reef. One Tree Island is 5 kilometers long by 3 kilometers wide. We were working on an 800 square meter patch of reef right here. So this, if you're taking the volume of seawater in this reef, assuming it's 4 meters deep on average, you're looking at 15 million cubic meters of seawater per day that you would be trying to neutralize ocean acidification for, and not accounting for future acidification, just what we're trying to offset today. It's about 60 to 80 micromoles per kilogram of DIC that you would need to offset in order to bring it back to pre-industrial levels. For that volume of seawater, that's 9 times 10 to the 5th moles of seawater per day that you're trying to neutralize. The next step depends on whatever substance you try to neutralize with. I just chose calcium carbonate, assuming you're going to grind it up and put it in the water, which has a molecular weight of 100 grams per mole. And so you would need, in order to mitigate 60 to 80 micromoles of CO2, you would need about 100 tons per day of calcium carbonate. And typically carbon capture and storage techniques range from $100 to $1,000 per ton of CO2. So for one day, what that would look like for this reef would be anywhere from $10,000 to $100,000. or almost $40 million per year. And that's, one tree reef is 0.06 cubic kilometers. The Great Barrier Reef is 23 cubic kilometers. So just to show at scale some of the challenges here. This I think I already kind of talked about, risks and limitations, so I'm going to skip over that one. I have 5 minutes left, so I'm just going to try to go quickly through some of these. So moving away from mitigation techniques of actually addressing the CO2 content, but saying, okay, the CO2 content is what it is, how can we help these ecosystems cope? Some of the techniques that have been proposed, so coral restoration is one, reef restoration. Restoration has been around for hundreds of years in silviculture. In the marine environment and with relation to coral reefs, it's been around a quarter of a century, about 25, 30 years that people have been actively doing it. Countless case studies from around the world. I think Steve was talking this morning about how coral nurseries or coral gardens have become increasingly popular, and techniques have really advanced over the last couple of years. We've actually become really good at growing corals. So you can fragment them, you grow them out. There are techniques like microfragmenting that actually cause them to grow 50 times faster than they would in the natural environment, and you fuse them together. There's all sorts of exciting things coming online. Again, this is to just increase the amount of coral on a reef, which is an ecosystem engineer, but there's a difference between corals and reefs. So you're restoring the number of corals that are on the reef, hoping that it will then facilitate biodiversity, fish biomass, et cetera. There's also been advances in promoting sexual reproduction on reefs. There was just a week ago a grant funded in Australia for something called the larval bot, which will, they're integrating robotics into trying to increase the scale over which we can do these types of things. Because one of the limitations with reef restoration is ultimately scale. A bottleneck in this process is coral-diver interaction, that at the end of the day, you're dependent on a diver going out and epoxying or gluing a coral onto the reef. And so whether we can use technology or robotics to try to bypass that and increase the scale over which we can do these things has been something a lot of people have been interested on. So this larval bot is an idea that's being funded to try to take larvae that were sexually derived, so enhancing genetic diversity, and use underwater drones to scatter them over reefs at scale and see whether that can have impact. So some exciting developments to stay tuned on there. Assisted evolution is another approach that arguably would be integrated into reef restoration techniques. So these aren't mutually exclusive, but there's 4 main ways that you would do this. So you would either selectively breed corals to find genetic individuals that were more resistant to stress, temperature, or CO2, and then preferentially cultivate those for outplanting onto a reef. Epigenetic tuning is one, so actually exposing these corals to sublethal stresses of temperature or CO2 in order to turn on genes that help them cope with stress. Steve mentioned this morning that corals have an endosymbiotic algae that heavily influences their phenotypic response. And so you can evolve the algae in the lab because they have a much shorter generation time than the actual coral to increase stress tolerance, and then potentially the idea is not inoculate the coral with those to enhance stress. And the last one is to manipulate the microbial community or the bacterial biofilms that are on these corals to enhance stress tolerance. We couldn't find, because this is an early area of research, we couldn't find costs for this either, and so we took costs for reef restoration, assuming it would be integrated into reef restoration. And so these are probably conservative because you need quite a bit more in terms of technological capacity to do this, but anywhere from $10,000 to $160,000 per acre for this type of approach, depending on the species and the technique and the country, et cetera. Again, scaling's an issue here. Scaling's an issue with all of these. And then, of course, we have passive techniques. And so these are much more conventional techniques of coping, helping ecosystems adapt to climate change and ocean acidification. Largely, there are four main strategies to this. So spatial risk spreading, or protecting similar habitats in different areas, spreading your risk out. Mitigating secondary sources of stress like nutrients, pollution, overfishing, maximizing ecological connectivity. So trying to connect source reefs with sink reefs so that you can increase genetic connectivity between reefs, and managing fish stocks, namely herbivores, so that they can pare down algal populations and help reefs or help corals grow. So just trying to look at some of these side by side, and from a comparison, this slide looks at costs, and one of the things that jumped out to us was the lack of data. And so business case scenarios and field trials would be really helpful for some of these things, so that we can actually tell managers, these are options that you would actually have, this is how much it's likely to cost you, and compare them side by side. Some of the cheaper options tended to be restoration based on the literature, depending on your approach, your species, and your country. Some of the more expensive options, physical restoration, which I didn't talk about, but that was creating artificial reefs, and then liming and phytoremediation, some of the mitigation techniques. A lot of the barriers to these are knowledge and the fact that we need. Most of these techniques right now are theoretical. There have been very few field trials. Most of them, if they've been tried at all, have been tried in the laboratory, have not been taken to the field, have not been tried at scale. So we have no idea what the ecological consequences would be of any of these. And we also don't know how much a lot of these would cost. So it's hard to fill in those gaps unless we do field trials and business case scenarios. And then this is just showing, based on all of those ecosystem services from that first slide, trying to compare side by side which technique supports which ecosystem service. So we have here storm and flood protection, erosion control, education, harvest, fisheries harvest, bioprospecting, and then phytoremediation, liming, geochemical buffering, et cetera. Again, this was really hard to get from the literature. There's not a lot of data available for this. And so a lot of this was expert interviews, looking at meta-analyses, and then trying to create an expert opinion, tracing through those logical pathways about what would support what. So more data here would help flesh this out. But what seemed the most viable for some of these was a reef restoration approach or a protection approach. I mean, we know from any restoration ecology standpoint that protecting the ecosystem in the first place is the best thing you can do. And then supporting that ecosystem to exist naturally is the next best thing. And intervening is kind of a last approach. So our conclusions from this were that more research is needed. Again, business case scenarios, field trials of some of them, so that we can actually give managers kind of some best practices, or at least a cost analysis of some of these things, or scalability analysis. And what we walked away from this exercise with is that in terms of mitigating CO2, there are options available to you, assuming that you do it in a way that your net CO2 emissions are going to be negative. But scalability is going to be a challenge. And for adaptation, there are also options available to you, but the long-term success of the project is difficult to project because of the lack of field trials for a lot of these things. And for any of these, this is something that's been talked about a lot today. You're going to probably sustain and rebuild only a subset of ecosystem services, but that's important. In a lot of scenarios, buying that time is important, trying to keep these things as intact as possible for the time that we have, and to include reef users and managers and everyone in the room when you're deciding what to do, so that everyone can be a part of that conversation. So I went a couple of minutes over, but hopefully I have time for a few questions.
Thank you. Nat Seddon, Oxford. So you quite placed quite a lot of emphasis on generating estimates of cost of implementation. But surely, especially when it comes to sort of incentivizing or capitalizing these sorts of approaches, it's the sort of the net costs that's important, and the sort of the natural capital value or the value of the ecosystem services that these reefs provide, which are enormous, aren't they, in terms of supporting fisheries and ecotourism and a whole load of other sort of economic benefits. So that's the important thing, that actually those numbers might be quite small relative to the massive benefits that we get from looking after or restoring or working with those ecosystems. So where are the data on those aspects?
Yeah, that's a really great point. Thank you for bringing that up. And it's for something I forgot to mention, was that one of the drawbacks we found for this was exactly that all of the cost estimates we could find were cost of implementation, without saying, well, this is how much fisheries you'll get back and the actual net gain of that. We only found, and I'm not going to be able to remember it off the top of my head, but I'd be happy to, I have it to show you at a break. We only found one example that actually was able to show cost of implementation of restoration, and most of these things aren't monitored long term. That's part of the problem, is that they'll be monitored for maybe, particularly with reef restoration, maybe 3 to 5 years. And then long term monitoring or gains are not, the data for that aren't really available. We found 1 or 2 cases that actually showed that it was cost effective depending on the technique. And I'd be happy to show those to you at a break, but that's a really, really valuable point. Steve.
Just to follow on that a little bit, and bringing it back to Chris's point about co-benefits, the seagrass example is one that is sort of intriguing. It costs a lot maybe to put those in, but work lately has shown that seagrasses can reduce diseases on coral reefs. They can actually reduce human diseases in communities living near seagrasses. So there's a lot of co-benefits possible with that solution. And so I just wonder whether or not there's a framework to build that in too.
Yeah, we have, we generally spoke about, thank you, that's also a really great point. It was a lot to get through in 20 minutes, and so I left out a few key things, but co-benefits and net costs are huge with any of these. And a lot of the co-benefits are education. Particularly if you're involving citizen science, or the general public in any of these techniques, which is a way to make it cost effective. Public education is huge, a huge co-benefit for this. Anything that's going to bring back some semblance of an ecosystem engineer, huge co-benefit. There are a lot of co-benefits with all of these, and how you apply it or where you apply it would also implicate what you got out of it. So with seagrass, I know Nancy gave the Tampa Bay example this morning, and I think the cost from that to go from the 70s till now was around $1 million a year, but it has supported billions of dollars worth of jobs and tourism in that area. So, something else I was going to say. With seagrass in particular, another way that they're implementing it is in hatcheries, co-cultivating oyster hatcheries and seagrasses at the same time, because we've had failures of hatcheries in the Pacific Northwest, and putting it in there with those oysters so that you can enhance survival of early life history stages, and then that feeds back into supporting a huge economic or source of income to Oregon and to Washington in terms of hatcheries and fisheries. So yeah, I think that that co-benefits is also a really important part of this, but that's another thing that we don't really have data on at this point. Daniela.
Daniela Schmidt, University of Bristol. I have a question. When you did your liming experiment, because you're basically looking at the carbonated part of the system, but of course there's the calcium part of the system, and calcium is a cell poison. Did you see any negative effects of that large calcium addition to the system to other organisms in the reef or to the coral itself?
That's a great question. We were doing short-term experiments. They were 1-hour experiments, so it was a very short-term response. And the only thing we were measuring was community calcification at that time. And so we were keeping everything below a pH of 9 because we didn't want brucite precipitation. And so we saw no negative impacts, but we weren't, the only thing we were monitoring for was net ecosystem calcification, which was enhanced. So there's a possibility that it was there, but everything was below 9, so there shouldn't have been any abiotic precipitation in the water. Pete.
Pete Mumby, University of Queensland. Great talk, Rebecca, and I love the way that you've very clearly articulated the challenge of doing this at scale, especially for something like the Great Barrier Reef. But we talk a lot about doing things at scale, and we always come to the same conclusion that we can't do this at scale if our scale is the whole ecosystem. But then it makes me wonder, what's the value in doing this at small scales? And that's a very different proposition. And so far, we mostly talk about this from the point of view of tourism operators can still maintain, a valuable tourism opportunity by doing restoration at small scales. But we don't tend to think as much as ecologists as what would be the benefits of some targeted interventions that are conducted at small scales, because that's the only scale at which this is financially feasible. But is there real value? And I don't know if you're going to have the answer to this, but we might want to think more about recasting this question at small scales, rather than always dismissing it on the grounds that it can't be done at scale.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I apologize if this came off as a dismissive of all of these. The take home is that there are challenges to all of these, but not that they're not worth doing. Perhaps I should have been clearer on the fact that there are net benefits, the fact that this is important at small scale. I think that the key to doing it, I think they are worth doing because we need to buy time and restore some of those services. I think the key to doing it is doing it in a targeted, collaborative way, because there have been a couple of people this morning that talked about how piecemeal this is being done right now. And there have been efforts, like Nancy mentioned, like 50 reefs, where you come together and you say, okay, if we can only restore X number of reefs, we're not going to be able to do everything. Which ones would we choose? And that boils down to, what are you trying to save? Is it biodiversity? Is it coastal protection? Which one of these services is most important to you? And so I think what we need is an array of solutions that we can implement depending on which service we want to do in which location. But I think that conversation needs to be had as a community in a very integrative way, so that we don't wind up all focusing our efforts in different directions, which is what's kind of happening right now, particularly with reef restoration. There's a ton of different people that are doing that separately, instead of coming together as a community and advancing it that much more efficiently. Do I have time for one more? Tim?
Tim Lenton, thanks, Rebecca. It was a great talk, and sat here, it felt a bit like a council of despair. It looked spectacularly expensive and, as you say, hard to scale up. But then I thought, no, I must go back and check what Costanza et al. Are thinking the value of coral reef ecosystem services are. And the literature estimates range from $37,000 per hectare per year to $2.13 million per hectare per year. Very large numbers, in the upper range, larger than the cost numbers I think you were showing. And they're using $350,000 per hectare per year as their current central figure. And as you've hinted, I think quite a lot of that is actually the coastal protection from storms service, which one might make a kind of case that might function anyway for a while, even if the poor corals weren't functioning. But I guess I got some comfort when I went back to those numbers and reminded myself that it's a cost. If you want to think like an economist, and the cost benefit, actually, if we honestly believe those numbers, your costs aren't that high compared to the benefits.
Right. So I think that goes back to Natalie's point of we need better numbers in terms of assessing net benefit from all of these, because they do sound exorbitantly expensive. But back to that first slide, all of ecosystem services, reefs in general, valued of upwards of $400 billion a year. And so implementing like even $10 million in order to salvage X million or $1 billion nets out as being worth it. And so that's the next step, is trying to take that step in this exercise. And so we need to be able to do those calculations, which we haven't yet. And so I think exercises, or where we can, with any of these restoration or adaptation techniques, that as scientists, it would be really valuable if we didn't stop at saying this is the implementation cost, but if we monitored long term, or if we were able to then somehow follow that through, even just through logic pathways of saying, well, this is how much you should get in 5 to 10 to 20 years out of this, so that we can do the net calculations. Thank you.